I'm Emily Kumler, and this is Empowered Health.
On my 21st birthday, my mom showed up at my friend's apartment and we were about to go out. And when I saw her face, I was really excited because I thought she was going to be coming out with me and celebrating. But as soon as I saw, kind of realized what was going on, I knew something had happened. And she had come to tell me that my dad had unexpectedly passed away of a deep vein thrombosis. So basically, he threw a blood clot. I had known he had a blood clot, but never in my head did it even occur to me that he would die. So that kind of threw me into this world of what it means to grieve and what it means to lose a parent. And it's a club that at one point or another most people join, but until you're in it, you don't really understand what that means. That experience, I was more in the back seat. I'm an only child and my parents were divorced. So my aunt and uncle were taking over as the executors of the will in the estate. But through a lot of just family turmoil, which often comes, floating up to the top after such a significant loss, I found myself 2 years later in the role of accepting the role of the executor of my dad's estate, which meant I had to, close on two different houses and clean out his properties. It was a very steep learning curve, and it's just one of those sink or swim situations. In the middle of that, my grandpa, I was very close with him. He basically raised me as a kid. He babysat me every day. He was diagnosed with pancreas cancer, and that was my first experience with having an expected loss, right? So there's a really big difference in grief and grieving between an unexpected loss and one that you're expecting. You begin grieving the moment that you hear that news. He did one round of chemotherapy and then went on hospice care. And he ended up living 7 or 8 months with pancreas cancer, which really is unheard of because it's usually a really quick disease. But we had some great memories, and it was a really beautiful experience. He had an amazing team of people who worked with him at hospice that really made me super engaged and interested in how we're caring for people at end of life and what does that look like and where are the problems in this and the way that the system is working with that right now.
That was Sarah Miller. After experiencing those major losses in her early 20s, she became really interested in how we could better manage this end of life phase. I think both for the person who's dying and for their loved ones. And so that sort of led her to do research and find that there are actually end of life doulas. So much like when you have a baby and you're pregnant and you're thinking about all of that, many women hire a doula. The job is to support the mom through the pregnancy and sort of let her know what it's going to be like and figure out individual ways that you can make the birthing experience a better one. The same thing is true for an end-of-life doula. It's not palliative care, although they do work closely with end-of-life doctors. But in this case, it's more about everything from kind of like estate planning to also trying to figure out, do you want to be buried? Do you want to be cremated? Having some of those conversations that sometimes falls to doctors and sometimes people just don't have because they find them to be uncomfortable or, too emotional in some cases. And so an end-of-life doula's job is to really support the person who is dying along with their, sort of family or friends or other people who are important in their life. As we're going to go back and hear from Sarah, in order to be a really good end-of-life doula, you have to be really comfortable with death, because your job is to help the person dying feel more comfortable with death. So that was sort of the first step. She had to find a way to become more comfortable with the end of life. And so then how has this whole experience, and I think it's important to say you haven't actually helped somebody die as a hired doula yet, right? Like you're in the process of learning all of this stuff, but haven't had that direct experience. Is that correct?
That's correct. I've worked with a couple hospice patients, so I volunteer at a local hospice. I've worked with some hospice patients, and I was with my grandpa when he passed. So I attended at his bedside for 3 days. I slept next to him. I held his hand as he took his last breath, and it was that moment actually was really one of the most beautiful of my lifetime. And that was kind of the moment where I knew I wanted to become a doula. And the person who ended up giving my grandpa's service was She worked as a doula for 30 years before doulas were even really a thing. And as soon as she was telling me, how she got into it when she did, I'm like, wow, that is my calling. That is what I want to do. I want to help accompany people through this part of their life. That mixed with being there with my grandpa was just such a powerful experience.
So, how has this made you think about life differently?
Ugh, love that question. I could talk about that all day. So I really believe that only through understanding death may we know life and may we appreciate life. It's the duality of our existence and really what brings life meaning is knowing that we will not be here forever. So I think for me, experiencing a lot of loss before, I'm not even 25 yet, experiencing the loss of both parents and my grandpa, it's made me so much more appreciative of this simple thing, taking a walk and enjoying the breeze in the air, or smelling in the smell of the ocean. Those little things that really don't seem like big things really are the big things. But also I think it's made me much more in tune with what's my purpose on this earth and what am I here to do. In a way, I think that I've been given a really beautiful gift at a very young age. So a lot of people don't necessarily come to that conclusion until they're much older. So I've been given this gift of being able to understand my life purpose and act on that. So I know that I'm here. My purpose on being on this earth is to help people. And that's what I'm really passionate about. That's what I want to do. And in this season of my life, I think it's helping people through death, but I'm also very accepting of the fact that things morph and change. And that's kind of how life works. And I think finally, the thing that really I've learned from all of this and truly is most important is the relationships in our life and the people that we have in our lives. In the past couple of years, I've become an orphan and I've been caring for my grandma. And I'm so thankful to have that relationship with her, as trying and taxing as it may be. Having her as my family is wonderful. But I also know that I would not have made it through these past years in my life without the incredible system of support that I've built around me and the people who I've surrounded myself with. So I have an amazing team of people I work with on my everyday job who have really shown up and helped me with a lot of things in my life after my mom passed away. I have a really great adopted family through my dad's girlfriend, who I was actually just in Myrtle Beach with all of them this weekend. And it was just a really beautiful experience of feeling yourself being accepted into other people's families and building your own family of people, a network of people to support you through life's adventures.
So, I mean, I think one of the things that is coming up for me in talking to you is this idea that you have sort of, this isn't the right word, but like embraced death, right? Like as
Hmm.
this inevitable, which we know it is. But
Hmm.
everybody has, or most people, I guess I should say, have like a tendency to push away from it, right? To either deny it
Hmm.
or when it happens to like sort of want it to be over with. And, the using the term orphan, I think is so interesting because I think when you lose a parent, or certainly when you lose both parents, you are sort of technically an orphan, but that term is usually used for children, right?
Hmm.
And that sense of loss is not any different as a grown up, right? Like you still feel
Hmm.
like your parents are anchors for you in some way. Losing an anchor means your whole perspective changes, right? Or that your whole rooting system of having a place that you can then springboard from becomes vulnerable in a whole new way.
Hmm.
So it's interesting because I think it just sounds like you're the kind of person that runs towards the fire rather than running away from it, but to the benefit of other people, which is really
Hmm.
profound. And so the fact that you've had all of this death happen to you in such close proximity, in terms of time, I think some people might just become really insulated, right? And not want to feel emotion and not want to be
Hmm.
vulnerable because that's a lot of vulnerability to deal with. And that's a lot of concern over, even just things that you think you can count on in life, realizing you can't. And
Hmm.
so, I mean, I feel like one of the things that I definitely want you to try and explain to us is like when you're thinking about helping other people through this, I guess we could say like transition, right? Or like, I guess transition isn't the right word for the person dying, although maybe some people believe that there is an afterlife or that this is just, the final time here on earth or in this world. But in terms of helping a family, what do you think the biggest things are that you have learned, both from your sort of academic interest in this and the research you've done, which is extensive, also from your personal experience, that people don't usually think going into it that you think is profoundly helpful?
I mean, there's a lot of things, right? So let's kind of take this section by section. I think people grossly underestimate the physical toll that grief will have on them and the length of time you will be grieving, which, by the way, spoiler here, it's forever. It never stops. I saw this interesting post on Facebook a couple weeks ago. It said, I sat with my anger long enough until she told me her name was grief. So very often as we go through the different stages of grief, which also, by the way, is not a linear process. It's a very tangled web of confusion. As we go through that process, a lot of different emotions will come up for us. And some may look like anger, some will look like denial, some will look like relief, happiness, joy, and whatever it may be. I really want people to understand that all of it's okay. So whatever you're feeling in that moment, whatever type of emotions coming up, it's okay. And a big lesson for me and something I've learned in this whole experience of life is giving yourself the permission to sit with what you're feeling and loving yourself enough to experience that is extremely profound. And really, it's the quickest way to heal.
I feel like that idea of sitting with something is so popular, but I'm not
Mhm.
sure very many people actually understand what does that mean, because it's intensely uncomfortable, right?
Yes. Some days I'm not sure I even do. But for example, after my mom passed away, I was thrown into this role of primary caregiver for my grandma. And I had to move her from Buffalo to be with me in DC. And it's been quite the taxing journey. And there are a lot of days where I just feel really angry with her. And I'm just angry about the situation and how ungrateful she can be at times. And this probably isn't the best side of me, but I'm just very angry. And a lot of times I will take that anger out, not necessarily on her, but I may not be as friendly as I want to be to her. And I may not be as bubbly or happy or positive around her as I could be. But I'm also in the back of my head trying to figure out 8 million things like, how do I get her scripts picked up? I need to call her insurance company. I need to figure out, selling her house and doing all of these things that she's not really recognizing. But for me, being able to identify that anger and say, okay, Sarah, are you really angry at your grandma? Like, she's not done anything in this situation wrong. She's just, she's grieving just as much as you. And one, not feel guilty for feeling that anger, I think is a big part. And not to say that I don't feel guilty, but actually sitting down, something that helps for me is sitting down and getting out a piece of paper and kind of just automatically writing what I'm feeling and recognizing that and giving space for that so that maybe next time when I interact with her, I won't have as much anger kind of festering. But I think the biggest takeaway there is trying not to feel guilty about whatever emotion I'm having and recognizing that this is part of my grieving process.
After talking with Sarah, we wanted to go a bit deeper and sort of understand, is this a new trend, or is this like something that's been going on for a long time? And what's sort of involved in the training of an end of life doula? And so we found an organization that's called the International End of Life Doula Association. Perfect, right? So we called up the president and founder, and we asked her a little bit about what is this process and why is this something that more and more people seem to be interested in, both hiring somebody to do and also becoming an end-of-life doula.
My name is Janie Racco. I am the president of the International End-of-Life Doula Association, better known as INELDA. We are a nonprofit that teaches people how to become end-of-life doulas, as well as going to hospitals, hospices, and communities to teach them how to have an end-of-life doula program.
One of the things that I thought we could start by talking about is just sort of, this seems to be I don't want to say like a new phenomenon, because I feel like there certainly are periods of history where end of life sort of planning and celebration are certainly parts of cultures. But it feels to me, I'm 42, like this is becoming something, and maybe that's why, that is becoming more popular. It's becoming like more of a thing that people are interested in learning about and clearly studying.
Yes.
And also sort of signing up for. Can you talk a little bit about how, as somebody who's been in this world for a long time, you have seen this trend develop, if that's accurate to say?
Yeah. No, that's completely accurate. Yes, it's really kind of exploded, I'd say, in the last 3 years. I've been doing this work for about 12 years, specifically as an end of life doula. And when I used to tell people years ago the work that I was doing, they'd say, "A what? A who? And what does that mean?" And, their eyes would glaze over. And now, within, I'd say, the last 3 years, there's so much buzz about end of life and how we in our society now are really not doing it right, that people, I think, are yearning to understand how we can do death better or more consciously. And so this whole field has completely exploded in the last, I'd say, I've noticed within 3 years. We started our trainings at Enelda about 5 years ago. We had our first training, and I think we had 25 people there. Now we train across the country, about 18 trainings in a year, and we go to other countries, and we're now selling out. We have to close them down at about 60, 65 people. So you are absolutely correct.
That demand is coming from people who want to learn how to be doulas, which I suppose we could assume means that there's a demand for people who want to hire people who want to be end of life doulas. Is that also correct?
So let's just back up a little bit, because I don't know if everybody understands what a doula is.
Okay, great.
So most people think of a doula as a birth doula, if they've even ever heard of it. What we have kind of, I don't want to say developed, but we have honed in on doing this work at end of life. And an end of life doula, as we call it, you could call it a death doula, but I like the term end of life doula, is a non-medical person who supports and guides a dying person and their loved ones through the last months, weeks, days of their life. So when somebody is diagnosed with a terminal illness, that's usually the time that the end of life doulas will come on board, if possible. Sometimes it could be a year before that, if somebody wants to think about their death and talk about it, or it could be really almost at the end, at any time.
And I think it was probably also important for you to clarify, what is the difference between an end of life doula and a sort of hospice care?
Yes, so we get that question a lot. I like to think of it that the end of life doulas work in conjunction with hospice, kind of hand in hand. Hospice is an amazing system for people that are dying. We always tell people, if you can get on hospice, if you have a diagnosis of 6 months or less, 2 doctors have signed off on that, you're eligible for hospice. Hospice has the most amazing services. They have an interdisciplinary team of nurses, doctors, social workers, chaplains, volunteers. But what the doula can do in that situation is spend so much time with the person who is dying and their family. Hospice, the interdisciplinary team only has a certain amount of hours for each patient. That's just the way the money is structured that they get. They don't have a tremendous amount of time to sit with somebody and maybe to talk about their life and to talk about meaning in their life, to maybe explore legacy projects. Not that they don't want to do it, not that they don't do pieces of it, but the doulas have all the time to be able to create these very special projects during this time that the hospice workers cannot do.
So can you speak a little bit from your experience of having done this, of what that kind of looks like?
I had a woman approach me who was in her 50s, had stage 4 breast cancer. She was divorced. She had 3 children. She knew she was dying at some point. She didn't know when. Her doctor did not put a date on it quite yet. She wasn't at that point. So she wanted to get together with me because although she had a support system of family and friends, she wanted somebody in her corner. She wanted somebody who knew her wishes and would advocate for her and was an objective source. So not a sister, not a brother, not a cousin, not a best friend, because emotions get involved there. She wanted to say, this is what I want, and I know you'll be able to carry that out. And that went from where she wanted to die, how she wanted to die, how she felt about medication, what she wanted to do for her kids before she died. She told me about all the players in the family, who could be there at bedside, who she didn't want to be there. Really total picture from beginning to end. And that's exactly how it worked. We were able to talk about her kids. I was able to help her create legacies for her kids. She left beautiful, we put it in picture frames. She did sayings for each child and what they meant to her. She asked me to talk to her about what may happen, how may she die in terms of the typical progression of a disease. What would that look like? And so she really had me there as her advocate and her gatekeeper.
So it's interesting to me because I'm somebody who just generally believes that the more information we have, the more we feel in control and the less anxiety we have, which I think on this podcast we talk a lot about in terms of women's health and just sort of getting access to good information in general. But I wonder from your perspective, I mean, this idea of dying has been or is something that is very taboo, right? I mean, like some people don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Some people feel it's very off limits. But it's also one of those things where I can imagine, and I mean, I don't know, it's such a personal experience, but what you're talking about or how you're describing this is making me really think what you're doing is you're giving somebody accurate information about what they're going to experience.
Yes.
So they don't feel surprised.
Exactly. And we don't know everything. I said to her, let me talk to your doctor or nurse so I can understand. I'm not a medical professional. I've done this long enough that I might know the normal progression of how a death may go, but we've been surprised. Usually somebody stops eating, stops drinking, kind of goes into a coma-like state. But there's been times where I've had a patient and I'm talking to them and the next day they died, totally unexpected. But if you're armed with information, it's so, so helpful. If we don't talk about it, then so many conversations get missed. She wanted to talk to her kids who were in their late teens and early 20s and say, I'm done. I can't fight anymore. And here's what I want you to know. And here's how I want things to go. And was it hard? Yes. Was it emotional? Extremely. Everybody was crying. But she gave them that gift of saying, you don't have to guess. Here's what I want to happen. And here's what I want to say to you before I die. And it can be so beautiful. But those opportunities are missed when people say, I don't want to talk about it. I'm going to, let's assume I'm going to just get better.
Yeah, right. Well, and that sort of sense of denial also makes everybody in that state of denial, right? Like if the person who's leading the charge. I mean, it's striking to me too, the word doula. I haven't looked up the etymology of it. My mom's a big word etymology person, so I always like to look up where words come from. Yeah. But, like there is something to me about it reminds me a little of being pregnant where you're like, my body's changing. What's going on? And everyone's like, oh, don't worry. You're fine. And you're like, fine, I'm fine. But like, I still want to know what's happening. Right. Or like, how is this baby actually going to come out of my vagina? Right. Like that seems impossible.
Right.
And when people don't talk about it, I actually really think that increases the fear that the mom feels of like, there is this sort of mystery. Like, do people not know? And that's why no one's telling me? Or is it so awful that no one wants to talk about it? Neither of which is the case.
Right. It's not only the fear. Another point is failure. So I had another patient I was working with, and she said to me, No one wants, I can talk to you about it, but no one will talk to me about what is really happening.
Mm.
Every time I want to say something about how I feel or that I'm dying, everyone says, "Oh, stop, stop. No, you're going to get better. You're going to fight it. You're going to win. It's a battle. It's all war talk. It's a battle. You're going to survive. You're going to beat this."
Yeah, I hate that. Like that's like a huge pet peeve of mine when people are like, "Yeah, I kicked cancer's ass." You're like, "What
Right.
does that say about all the people who
Yeah.
died?"
And it makes them feel, she said, I know I'm not going to beat this. I have a diagnosis that I am dying.
Yeah.
There's no way out of this unless there's a miracle. So, every time I try to talk about it, they try to turn the conversation around because it's uncomfortable for them.
Hmm.
But then again, you miss that great opportunity to say so many things you might want to say before you die to somebody.
I mean, as a culture, what do you make of that? I mean, because it strikes me that there is something about wanting to appease the other person or like comfort them by denying the true diagnosis.
I think that's part of it. I think people don't want to open up a Pandora's box of emotions because it will, and that's
Mm-hmm.
okay. But I think people are afraid to go there. What if I make them sad? I don't want to make them sad. What if they start crying? Well, they may, and you may. Everybody may be a mess for a while, but that will lead to something so rich and deep after that. I don't know how this all started. I do know 100, 120 years ago, we did death very differently. But, maybe once these big institutions came along, hospitals, now assisted living, people live all over the country and the world. We're no longer comfortable with death. We're kind of like spectators. We're told when we can visit, when we need to leave. Many people have never seen a person die. Medical technology and advances have also, created it so that people are living longer. And death was familiar and all around you 120 years ago. It's not anymore. And so I think people have become very anxious and fearful because it's an unknown to many people.
And do you think that that's a change in our like sort of comfort with emotions, or do you think that that's like a germ theory, like don't go near dead people kind of thing?
I just think that because it's not around you and it's not something that's part of your everyday life and that you're familiar with, that people have been afraid. Children used to go to funerals. I don't Something happened in the last 50, 60 years where, people would say, "Oh, no, 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 they can't come. I don't want them to see what's going on."
Hmm.
Wasn't spoken about. My mother, who has since died, but when she was little, her brother died and nobody ever talked about it. She just remembers her mother crying and he was never spoken about again. So it's somewhere along that line, things really kind of went haywire in our society related to death and dying.
Well, even if you go back and read like Grimm's fairy tales, right, or like older kinds of stories, there's sort of like this morbidity woven into all of that stuff that's pretty graphic.
Yeah.
I've always sort of assumed part of that was that the child mortality rates were so much higher,
Yeah.
that kids were dying all the time. And so you kind of expected you'd have 5 kids and 3 would live. Like it was just a very different way,
Right. Even, disease or a plague or something could wipe out, most of a family. It was very, very different. And not that it was better, but somehow along the line, we lost our way to be comfortable with death.
So then on a very personal level, I feel like, one of the things we could all learn from you is how have you learned to be so comfortable with that?
I think that the more you talk about it and the more you normalize it and the more you're around it, it just becomes part of your life. Like, my kids who are now in their 20s, it's not unusual for us to have a discussion. Oh, I don't want that when I die, but I want that when I die. My son is in the music industry, and about 5 years ago on Facebook, he created his death playlist, which, people were saying to him, "What do you mean? What do you mean? Why are you doing that?" And it was really like, I'm just being thoughtful. If I were to die, this is what I'd love to hear. So in our house, it was just kind of a normal conversation. And so I think the more you normalize it, that's what's happened in my life. It's not so scary anymore. And I guess because that's what I do now, it's just part of life.
But there's a difference between creating a playlist and being truly comfortable with death, right? I mean, like
Of course.
I joke, a lot with my sister, especially that like when I die, I want to be thrown off a boat so that
Yeah.
the animals can eat me and I become part of the ecosystem of the ocean. And she's like always like, okay, that's great. I'll be the one to have to rent a boat and throw your body over and like get arrested and, the whole nine.
Right.
But the truth is we're joking. That would be great. If that could happen, that would be my ideal way to go. But that doesn't mean that I'm comfortable dying with the idea that I'm going to die.
I that's so hard for any of us to say. Am I comfortable with the idea that I'm going to die? Probably not, because it hasn't happened to me and I haven't been given a diagnosis. So I'm comfortable around death. I'm comfortable being with people who are dying, and their loved ones. I haven't experienced a diagnosis like that. So I don't know if I'll be comfortable with dying. I have a strong belief for myself of once I'm dead, I'm okay. So that part of it doesn't scare me. Does it scare me to get there? Possibly, yeah. Who wouldn't be? We haven't gone through it.
Mm-hmm.
So that part of it, actually thinking of the fact that I could be dying or if I had a diagnosis, would be tough. I've never been there. But am I comfortable talking about it and being around it? Yes.
It strikes me that there's so many people who have lost loved ones in this opioid crisis,
Yeah.
right? Where like, the person who's, I don't know if we're even saying addicts, but I would say like the victim of the opioid
Yeah.
usage. There's probably a better way to say that, but I don't know what the technical thing is right now. But, those families that are left behind
Yes.
would probably benefit from a doula. Is that appropriate or is that?
Yeah, we talk a lot about sudden deaths and the role of a doula then, and it's really to go in and help the family or the loved ones with, grief, talking about it, maybe doing legacy work, which means something about the person who has died and it living on, for generations, can be done at any point. That could be done after somebody dies. So a memorial, some sort of writing letters to the person who had died, gathering stories about the person who has died, that can all still be done after the death. So even though it's a sudden death, there are many things that the doula still can facilitate. Ritual work, all coming together and perhaps getting into a circle and holding hands, saying a prayer, lighting candles, doing something on the anniversary of the death or the birth every year. There is lots of work that can be done in a sudden death.
And I'm sort of curious, like having been witness to so many people, while they're going through this end of life transition or finality or whatever we want to say, are there things that you find to be common themes? I mean, I feel like people often will say like, oh, everybody on their deathbed wishes that they had spent more time with their family, right? Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but you're actually somebody who's seen a lot of this. Are there any patterns or things that you have been able to reflect on as sort of interesting, regardless of the person who's dying, that's a shared feeling?
I think it's not really a common theme. I'm starting to see a little bit that some people die how they lived. And this doesn't always happen, but I am starting to see this thread that if somebody was very laid back and peaceful, again, depending on the disease, but if it's not a very painful disease that they're dying from, then they may die in a calmer manner than somebody who was more anxious and uptight. That's not a scientific fact.
No, that's an interesting observation. I mean, that would make sense, right? Like there's some sort of consistency to how you approach transitions.
Right. But there isn't one size fits all. Like, I teach our doulas that every death is different and you have to treat it differently. There's not like everyone at their last breath is not going to say, I love you, or is not going to say, you're forgiven. It's really not like that. Every single one is unique to the person who is dying because we're all unique.
So when somebody signs up for your course, can you tell us a little bit about what the curriculum involves?
Yeah. So the curriculum is 2.5 days, 3 days that we are together. And we teach our doula model that my business partner, Henry Fursko Weiss, who was a social worker in a hospice, that he developed. And we talk about structured life review, talking to the person really about their life. Who are they? What have they been through? Tell me about your family. We talk about legacy projects and how to create them for family and loved ones. We talk about a vigil plan, which is really a document, like a blueprint of how they would like to die. And there's tons of elements within that vigil plan, like where do you want to die? If you could, would you die at home? What room? Your bedroom? Was that too difficult? Would you rather be in a living room near the kitchen where everybody congregates? Or do you want to be maybe in a hospice facility because it would be too hard to die at home? What kind of music? What kind of sounds? What kind of touch? So vigil plans are a big part of it. We teach guided visualization for both pain relief and for the caregivers too, because they're usually very anxious and afraid. We teach about rituals. We touch on grief. And then we talk about signs and symptoms, what they may see, so that the doulas understand what they're looking at when somebody is dying. And then we talk about self-care. And we do a ton of experiential exercises within that weekend, because if doulas are asking people to open up about their lives, they have to understand what that feels like with somebody who they don't know.
And so when you say rituals, do you mean like you're bringing in different religious traditions that are helpful?
It's rituals based on that person. So if that person is religious, okay, tell me about your religion. What does that mean to you? Are there certain books? Are there certain prayers? But it could be there were two daughters whose mother was dying, and their ritual was to light these 3 candles every day, one for each daughter and one for the mother. Every day, the ritual while the mother was alive was lighting these candles. And when the mother died, they took the mother's candle and lit their own too and extinguished hers. That was a ritual. It could be something so simple, doesn't have to be elaborate.
And so what is the power of that?
So the power of that is really to understand that something meaningful is going on right now, and let's recognize that, and let's kind of memorialize it and remember it. Think about how many rituals there are just in everyday life, like a birthday. People light candles and they blow them out and they sing happy birthday. When my father died, my father used to have like a little glass of vodka every night when he came home from work to help him unwind. And, my sister, my brother, and I used to kid around like, don't ask dad anything until he's had that little bit of vodka, because the answer will be no. But after my dad took his last breath, my brother, my sister, and I were there, and my brother went over to the liquor cabinet. This wasn't even discussed, poured a little shot of vodka for each of us, and we just toasted. We sat around my dad and toasted to his life and what he meant to us. That's a ritual. And now every year on the date of his death, it's a remembrance. We toast to my dad. Everyone starts texting each other in the family, a little bit of vodka to toast to dad and tell stories.
I love that. That's wonderful. And I feel like that's so easy for anybody to do,
So
right?
easy. I
Yeah.
mean, people think of legacy and ritual as these huge projects and this huge thing. And it could be something that is so basic and so simple. A ritual could be when somebody's dying, before you walk into the room, everyone takes off their shoes. That's a ritual. It just brings you into the present moment and makes you understand that something momentous is now happening in this room.
Yeah. And it's action, right? Like
Yeah.
you're taking an action.
And it's focused and directed.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like it also, there's the honoring part of it as doing it on the anniversary that allows you permission to talk about that person on that day.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure I've said this before on the podcast, but I have this sort of internal thing, which I think I really learned from my dad, which is that people's stories are the most important commodities that they leave behind. And that there is this sort of interesting thing that happens when somebody dies, which is that over time you talk about them less and less.
Yeah.
And that they're sort of, they stay with you in those moments where you're telling a story about them. They're there, right?
Yes.
And they're present with you as you recall those things. And then as you need them less and less, you talk about them less and less. And so, and I think, you know, as a journalist, that really resonates with me as something incredibly important, that when somebody shares their story with me, that I'm being trusted with their most valuable commodity, right? Like it doesn't matter how much money you leave behind. If
Right.
nobody talks about you, or if they talk about you in a terrible way, then you're kind of worthless, right? Whereas if you serve people in moments of comfort or happiness or humor, you know, people see something and it makes them laugh because they think of you, that's a really wonderful legacy. And I think this idea of doing something as a ritual when they die that you can keep going on probably is a very multifactorial thing.
Yeah. And it helps with grief. It keeps the person alive. You know, that
Mhm.
love does not go away. That love is there forever. And so to remember them in those ways is really honoring them, like you said before. And that's part of the ritual.
And so what do you say to the people who sort of say, you know what, like that, I don't want to be reminded because it's just going to make me feel sad?
It may make them feel sad. We don't, as doulas, we don't push anything on anyone. We may suggest something and we may suggest try it. If it doesn't work for you, then it doesn't work for you. You know, it may not work, but what we teach is understand all these possible tools that you could have and use as a doula. You're not going to use every single one on every single case, but you may hit one or two that will resonate for that person.
So if we went back 100 years, you know, would it be the local religious figure that would be doing these kinds of things? Or like, who was the person who was charged with this? I mean, in some ways, it sort of feels like a family member,
Yeah.
right?
It was either the family member or, everyone was around who was supporting this. I think really it was almost like the village. Everybody was pitching in
Yeah.
and helping in all different aspects, cooking meals, helping with the burial, up on the hill. It was just, I feel like it was much more of a community event than it is now.
Yeah. I mean, I had a very close friend growing up, and her mom had breast cancer, and she died when I think I was like in my freshman or sophomore year of college. And I came back, obviously, to try and help her with stuff. She was the eldest of three girls, and she was stuck doing everything. And it was unbelievable to me that, like, she and I went to look at caskets. I mean, it was like, this is crazy that you're doing, you know what I mean? Like, this
Yeah.
is your mom, and you're still kind of a child. And what is where is the community? And like, not that you could really delegate that to somebody else who wasn't super close, right? Like,
Right.
that's the part that I think is so interesting about this becoming a new kind of field, because had there been somebody back then who I could have called and said, like, hey, we really need some help over here, like, we've
Yeah.
never done any of this before, it seems really expensive. I mean, like, there's a lot of things that come up that were really surprising.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I think people are living longer. There's a lot of medical advances. And so, you're not seeing people die regularly in their 40s or 50s anymore. And so maybe it is once or twice in your lifetime that you're dealing with that. And so, people just don't really know what to do.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, you also have this sort of idea of like you're so vulnerable emotionally at the end, right? That like you're not necessarily thinking clearly about.
Right. And that's why it's really helpful to have the doula because all those things can be said. If somebody dies and you have no idea, did they want to be buried? Did they want to be cremated? What did they want at the funeral? If you have no idea and if it's never been spoken, then that's when fights start. Sisters, brothers, relatives, I think they wanted that. No, I don't think they wanted that. If you can make that all very clear beforehand, then it just makes everyone's life who's left behind so much easier.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you feel like has been really surprising or interesting in the course of the work that you've done, or even in training people that you can share with us?
I don't know if this is surprising or not, but what we tell our trainees and what we have found is that this informs us how to live our own lives. When you're working with people who are dying and they're so vulnerable and they let you into the deepest, darkest, stories and circle of their life, you hear things that maybe they've never told anybody else. And it kind of informs you how to live your life differently. You definitely look at life not how you would have, maybe through a different lens when you're working with people who are dying. Obviously, it gives you a lot more gratitude for just being able to walk, exercise, work out, do the things that you do in your everyday life when you're working with somebody who can't do any of those things and is losing all of that. So we tell our trainees that when you work with people who are dying, the gift is also for you. You're giving them a gift, but you're going to get it in return in your life too. So I think that sometimes people don't think about.
I mean, I'm sure that's really incredibly valuable, but that's also the part for me where I feel like in my own life, sometimes I find, especially since having had kids and thinking more about my own mortality, where I become like overly sentimental. Do you know what I mean? Like I'll look at the clouds and be like, oh my God, I'm so lucky to be alive. I'm so lucky to have had this day. And that can also feel sort of debilitating.
Well, I think if you get stuck in that or you get melancholy about that, then it can be debilitating. But if it's just a sense of gratitude, like how lucky am I that I woke up this morning and I am pretty healthy and I can do whatever I want today, as opposed to not being able to do anything like that. Just having those little reminders every day, I think it's just gratitude, and it just sets you on a path where you're not whining and complaining about every little thing. Not that you won't, because, this is life. Stuff happens and we get caught up. But there's these little reminders when you're working with people who are dying that life is pretty precious.
As more and more people are choosing to die at home, the numbers are actually the highest right now that they have been since the 1900s, when I would imagine most people died at home, not even by choice, but just out of the practical nature of, how the medical system was set up then. So more people are dying at home, and we also know that women are more likely to be the caretakers of people who are dying. And so I hope that this episode has brought up for you some of the things it's brought up for me, which is a really just sort of a general reminder that end of life is always going to be a really hard topic, right? Like it's always going to be really emotional. It's always going to be really sad. The finality of losing somebody that you love or thinking about your own life ending is really, really hard on a number of levels. Yet at the same time, like everything in life, having more information and feeling like you can openly communicate about things probably makes it a little bit easier. So I'm very grateful for these people who are out there training to do this and the support it gives, because a hospital environment is going to be naturally more stressful, and even just the sort of sanitized nature of your surroundings in a hospital. Whereas being at home with your loved ones and feeling like this is a process that you are aware of and that you've had some say in, and that you've been able to tell people the things that you wanted to tell them, or leave them gifts that will remind them of your life, or, planning your funerals, all of that kind of stuff. It just seems logical to me that you'd want to be an active participant in that. People are obviously going to be nervous about bringing those kinds of conversations up. So it makes all the sense in the world to have somebody whose job is to help facilitate those conversations, both between different people and also with the person who's dying, the person who will be experiencing this, and give them some control over it. I think we have such a hard time in this society talking about things that are hard and not wanting to upset people. In end of life care, that's got to just be rampant, right? Like, you don't want to say the wrong thing to the person who's dying and make them more upset or make them feel sad when they're happy, or say, do the wrong thing to somehow have a negative effect. You want everything to be positive. But the truth is, dying may not be so positive. And so having somebody who can help you have those conversations, both as the person who's dying and also as the person who's losing somebody, and getting people to communicate and giving the person some control, that makes a lot of sense to me.
I'm Emily Kumler, and that was Empowered Health. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to check out our website at empoweredhealthshow.com for all the show notes, links to everything that was mentioned in the episode, as well as a chance to sign up for our newsletter and get some extra fun tidbits. See you next week.